From chasing down runaway slaves, to stealing millions from wounded veterans, to doing nothing while the country burned to the ground. These are the 10 worst presidents in American history. And they're so bad, even I could do a better job. But first is Benjamin Harrison, who isn't exactly a household name. In fact, if you showed his face to 100 Americans, most would say, "Isn't that the guy from the Titanic?" But he actually made a huge mark, mainly by wrecking the economy and then vanishing before he could take the blame. Because in 1890, Harrison signed the McKinley Tariff, jacking up tariffs to nearly 50%. The idea was to protect American businesses, but what actually happened was prices skyrocketed. Foreign trade collapsed, and farmers got absolutely smoked. And as if that wasn't enough, he burned through the entire federal surplus like a kid after his first paycheck. But the worst part, none of this came crashing down until after he left office. When the Panic of 1893 devastated the economy and President Grover Cleveland was left dealing with the dumpster fire. No fair! But Harrison, he was long gone, chilling back in Indiana, writing books and pretending like nothing happened. So no, Benjamin Harrison didn't commit crimes or start wars. He just played Jenga with the economy and walked away as it collapsed. But none of that was as bad as Millard Fillmore, who turned every citizen into a slave hunter. Because in 1850, the nation was divided over slavery. The South was loving it. The North, not so much. But the South was threatening to secede. So in an effort to compromise and preserve the Union, Fillmore signed the Fugitive Slave Act, legally requiring every U.S. citizen to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. In other words, if a slave showed up on your doorstep and you offered them a glass of water, it could land you in prison, even if you lived in a free state. That's nuts! But as you may have guessed, this backfired. Because normal people who never cared about slavery were suddenly like, wait, what the f***'s going on? With abolitionist movements growing overnight, and more normies becoming radicalized by the day. So while Fillmore thought he was keeping the peace, he ended up pouring fuel on the fire, pushing the nation one step closer towards civil war. But that's not as embarrassing as this next president, William Henry Harrison, who holds the record for the shortest presidency in American history. 'Cause in 1841, Harrison was 68 years old, one of the oldest presidents elected at the time. So, to prove he still had energy for the job, he delivered the longest inauguration speech ever recorded, nearly 2 hours long. Man's out here with no coat, no hat, and no common sense. The old man just wanted to prove he still had it, a lot like your grandpa trying to do a kickflip on your skateboard. But a few weeks later, he came down with a bad cold that turned into pneumonia. For most of history, we thought it came from his crazy speech in the rain. But modern historians believe it was more likely typhoid from contaminated drinking water at the White House. Either way, 31 days after taking office, William Henry Harrison was dead. He didn't sign a single law or make one decision. Instead, he spent more time writing an inauguration speech than being an actual president. And to make matters worse, he triggered a constitutional crisis. Because at the time, nobody knew what happens after a president dies in office. It wasn't 100% clear if the vice president simply acted as president or became president outright. Thankfully, John Tyler stepped up and said, "I'm president now," and everyone just kind of went along with it. But what was William Henry Harrison's legacy? No scandals, no war, no nothing. Just one epic speech and a short stay at the White House. If there were a Hall of Fame for how to completely blow a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, Harrison would be a first ballot member. But at least he didn't, completely destroy America, like Franklin Pierce, who, came pretty dang close. 'Cause with his movie star good looks and smooth-talking speeches, Pierce became elected to deal with the whole slavery problem. But he quickly made one giant mistake: the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. You see, back then there was a bunch of unorganized land after the Louisiana Purchase. state lines were still being drawn, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act established the areas as U.S. territories. But it also stated that popular sovereignty would determine if slavery was allowed in each territory. In other words, the new settlers would vote on it, reversing the long-standing Missouri Compromise, which banned it above a certain line. So, what was the result? Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded Kansas with rifles, torches, and angry mobs. The territory quickly descended into chaos and bloodshed. Houses were burned, families slaughtered, and the 5-year bloodbath was nicknamed Bleeding Kansas. So what did Franklin Pierce do to stop it? Pretty much nothing. In fact, he backed the pro-slavery side, which formed an illegitimate government through voter fraud and violence. He even sent in federal troops to stabilize the new government. Pretty crazy times, because instead of calming tensions between the North and South, Pierce accelerated the nation's march towards civil war. But this next terrible president is one you might not expect, and that's Woodrow Wilson, who's known for his lofty ideals like championing the League of Nations and making the world safe for democracy. And hey, he did some pretty good stuff, like lead us through World War I. But here's the problem. Back at home, he levied some of the worst attacks on American freedoms in U.S. history. During World War I, he signed the Espionage Act and Sedition Act, making it a crime to criticize the government, the military, or even the flag. And hey, I love America just as much as the next guy. I'm a friggin' bald eagle. But this was downright crazy. Because under his administration, over 2,000 Americans were prosecuted, like journalists, union leaders, and everyday citizens who dared to speak their minds. Free speech, the bedrock of American democracy, was crushed under the weight of wartime paranoia. But Wilson thought it was totally worth it. 'Cause after World War I, he pushed for the League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization designed to maintain world peace. But there was one little problem. It was rejected by the U.S. Senate, out of fear that it would drag America into European wars. He couldn't believe it. But here's the funny part. The League of Nations still ended up happening with 63 other countries, just without the U.S. So Wilson was left crying outside the club. And to cap it all off, he punished Germany so severely after World War I with the Treaty of Versailles that it sowed the seeds for World War II. In the end, Wilson became a prisoner of his own ego, a man so obsessed with his vision he refused to bend, causing chaos at home and abroad. And Wilson's presidency had some eerily similar parallels to this next guy, George W. Bush, who entered the White House with a handshake and a smirk, until history threw him every disaster short of a meteor strike. First, 9/11. And to his credit, Bush brought the whole country together for about 6 months. But what followed reshaped the entire world, pretty much for the worse. First came the decision to invade Iraq, based on bad intelligence that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction. Turns out, he didn't. But by then, the US was locked into a $1 trillion war that cost over 4,400 American lives, wounded tens of thousands more, and destabilized the Middle East for decades. Thanks for your service. But like Woodrow Wilson, Bush gutted the civil liberties of Americans at home by passing the Patriot Act in October of 2001, which dramatically expanded surveillance powers of the federal government, allowing the NSA and FBI to surveil U.S. citizens without a warrant. Hey, is this thing recording me? So, although you can argue this was necessary at the time, many of these powers still exist today. I don't think these guys would be too happy about a surveillance state. Then came Hurricane Katrina, where the levees broke, New Orleans flooded, and the federal government's response was, "We're working on it." 'Cause as people were left stranded on rooftops, the government set up the Louisiana Superdome as the shelter of last resort. But when 30,000 people showed up, it turned out to be a nightmare. The roof was damaged, the power failed, and toilets overflowed, which just stinks. The whole fiasco reeked of government inefficiency, and Bush was the poster child. So not only was Bush messing things up back then, but Americans are still living with the consequences today. But speaking of messing stuff up, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, America needed a steady hand to unite the country. Instead, it got Andrew Johnson, a former slaveholder from Tennessee who, believe it or not, didn't exactly believe in racial equality. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which would grant citizenship and basic rights to formerly enslaved people. Things like the right to make contracts, own property, and be treated equally under the law. What the heck, man? But Congress wasn't having it. They overrode his veto and pushed through the 14th Amendment, locking those rights into the Constitution. But Johnson didn't back down. He found other ways to prop up the South, like issuing mass pardons to tens of thousands of Confederates. Because it's kind of a big deal when you take up arms against the United States. Most governments would throw you in jail or hang you for treason. But Johnson restored their rights and let them retake power in the South. His logic? We shouldn't kick the losers while they're down. But as you might have guessed, his plan backfired, because this started the Jim Crow era, created fertile ground for the Ku Klux Klan, and stoked racial tensions nationwide. In Congress's eyes, Johnson had basically undone the point of winning the whole Civil War. So they impeached him, the first presidential impeachment in U.S. history, where Johnson faced trial in the Senate and survived conviction by just one vote. Phew, that was close. As you can tell, post-Civil War America was crazy. We needed a leader to rise above the hate and pull the country forward. Instead, Johnson doubled down on division. But if you thought that was bad, get ready for Herbert Hoover, who promised Americans a chicken in every pot and a car in every garage. And honestly, people believed him. Because on paper, Hoover had a glittering resume. Self-made millionaire, humanitarian, and a respected public servant. This guy was going to usher America into a new golden age. Until the Great Depression hit. Just months into his term, the stock market crashed and Hoover froze. As a staunch capitalist, he believed the government intervention would only make things worse. So he sat back and let private charities and local governments handle the crisis. The results? Banks collapsed, businesses shuttered, and unemployment soared to 25%. I'm going broke out here, man! But the final blow came in 1932 with the Bonus Army protest, where 15,000 World War I veterans marched peacefully on Washington, D.C., demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised, money they desperately needed to survive. And Hoover's response? He sent in the U.S. Army. Led by General Douglas MacArthur, federal troops used tear gas, tanks, and bayonets to violently clear the encampment. And when photographs of assaulted veterans hit the front page of newspapers across America, it was game over. Hoover's legacy was sealed, not as a helper, but as a cold, clueless man who fumbled the Great Depression and turned tanks against our own veterans. No list of terrible presidents would be complete without the guy who watched the Civil War unfold from the front row and did nothing. An event so devastating, it almost killed the country forever. When James Buchanan took office in 1857, the nation was already tearing at the seams over slavery. He had a choice: take action and lead, or do nothing. Instead, he chose door number 3 and let the Supreme Court handle it, which led to the infamous Dred Scott decision that said Black Americans could never be citizens. And Buchanan celebrated. The debate was over in his mind. He even pressured justices behind the scenes to make a sweeping pro-slavery ruling, thinking this would settle the issue once and for all. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Instead, it lit a fire under the North. And 3 years later, Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, won the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. Nice work, Top Hat. The South panicked. With no more national power, Southern states began seceding from the Union before Lincoln took office. And Buchanan, who is still president, insisted that secession was illegal, but also claimed the federal government had no authority to stop it. Thanks for nothing, dude. By the time Buchanan left office, 7 states were gone. Federal forts had been seized, and America was free-falling into civil war. Buchanan's legacy isn't defined by scandal or one bad law. It's defined by his failure to act when the nation's very survival was at stake. Sheesh, I mean, it couldn't possibly get any worse than that, right? Well, believe it or not, it does, because this is the worst president in U.S. history. His name is Warren G. Harding, a man so unqualified for the job, he even admits it. Harding once privately said, "I am not fit for this office and should never have been here." And he wasn't wrong, because Harding ran on returning America to normalcy. Instead, he delivered the most corrupt administration of all time, stacking his cabinet with the Ohio Gang, a crew of poker buddies, party friends, and political cronies who looted the government like a bank robbery. Take the Teapot Dome scandal, where a Secretary of the Interior secretly leased federal oil reserves to private companies in exchange for bribes. Bad? Oh, you bet. But not as bad as the head of the Veterans Bureau, who embezzled millions meant for wounded soldiers. Or his Attorney General, who allegedly took kickbacks to look the other way while criminals ran wild during Prohibition. And while all of this was happening, Harding spent his days golfing, gambling, and drinking, which was illegal during the Prohibition, by the way. He even had multiple affairs while in office. This dude's the worst. Harding even admitted, "I have no trouble with my enemies. I can take care of my enemies in a fight. But my damn friends, they're the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights." And maybe the guilt started eating away at him, because Warren G. Harding died of a heart attack in 1923, mid-scandal, leaving the country shocked at the rot inside his administration. Harding's presidency didn't just damage trust in government, it shattered it. But hey, maybe that was a good thing, because today we're still skeptical of political corruption, even with it happening in front of our faces. How's that stock portfolio going up? But there you have it. The worst presidents in American history. Not only did they stink at their jobs, they nearly broke the country. But if you thought their legacies were dark, wait until you hear how they died. One choked on cherries. Another dropped dead from a stroke. And yeah, one got assassinated in broad daylight. This is how every president died and their last words. So click this video right here, because this one's over. And trust me, it only gets crazier.